In the 1st century AD, around the Roman city, with its magnificent public buildings, colossal aqueducts, and thousands of kilometers of roads extending across the empire, had become one of the most striking centers of attraction in the ancient world. The squares filled with statues, famous bathhouses, and culous towers made the city look much more magnificent than it was during the Republican era. However, behind this dazzling splendor, there was much more. Regardless of one's status, whether slave or master, rich or poor, every Roman breathed the same atmosphere when they descended into the forums, inhaling the same intensively scented air. They walked the same streets. Goods, animals, and construction materials transported by horses and carts moved from one side of the city to the other throughout the day. The hustle and bustle of intense work continued until the evening. Waking up to the smell of ash and smoke in the early hours of the day was a normal occurrence. Although the fire of 64 AD became popular in imperial history, fires were actually a part of daily life in Rome. The city's residents began their day by inhaling the burnt smoke coming from a few meters away, unless they were awakened by screams disrupting their sleep. Wood, used in the construction of buildings clustered in rows in these corners of the city, was the most important element fueling forest fires. Many people lived miserably in apartment units called insula, which were generally constructed as 5 to 7 stories. Nevertheless, especially urban areas of the empire like Rome, Pompeii, Antioch, and Carthage were like a magnet for those desiring a better lifestyle. This led to serious problems for newcomers in these cities due to intense migration movements in the previous centuries. The logic of renting homes became quite popular thanks to the investments made by wealthy Romans. However, even large families had to live in small insula apartments with 1 or 2 rooms, and these apartment blocks became more crowded every day. In addition to fires, collapses due to overloading turned insula apartments into death traps. By 150 BC, approximately 46,000 insula had been built in the city of Rome. It is estimated that their numbers increased during the imperial period. After the fire of 64 AD, various laws were enacted regarding these apartment blocks, roads were expanded, and access to insula apartments was facilitated. In addition, laws were enacted during the Augustus and Tiberius periods that imposed various height restrictions on insula apartments. However, Rome's greedy investors quickly found ways to circumvent these laws. Most Roman elites lived in spacious and comfortable residences called villa, built in rural areas to get away from the noise and crowds of the city. These structures were usually self-sufficient, designed to accommodate many slaves working in the fields, as well as some craftsmen such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and potters. Water was transported to the villas from aqueducts through private pipes, providing both the water needed for irrigation and the water used for drinking. The person who owned and organized the villa was called dominus, and his wife was called domina. Everything, from cooking meals to arranging the surroundings, from the slaves' tasks to the orders of craftsmen, was under the control of the dominus. Everything had to run smoothly because if there was a mishap, the one who had to be accountable was once again the dominus. Looking back at the daily life in ancient Rome in our modern world, it might seem quite mundane for many people. However, for Roman elites, the situation was far from dull. Gladiator fights, the most popular activity of the time, garnered attention similar to modern sports competitions. In fact, many Roman girls and women did not hesitate to make high payments for scarves made from the ropes of famous fighters. Religious holidays and festivals were eagerly awaited because well-off Romans engaged in trade during such activities, earning substantial amounts of silver while enjoying themselves. The affluent were surrounded by servants and slaves who fulfilled their every desire, indulging in an extravagant lifestyle amid luxurious furniture. Many of them hosted private dinner parties, sampling exotic dishes prepared for the day. Meals were consumed in dining rooms called triclinium, and despite its peculiar appearance now, Romans loved to dine while reclining, hence the presence of several couches alongside their lavishly adorned tables. The workforce for such extravagance was largely managed by slaves. Consequently, new free citizens coming to the city often faced the challenge of finding employment. Even if they managed to find a job by somehow plunging into the city's chaos, they eventually struggled to pay their rents as time went by. Just like in any age and geography, poor Roman citizens frequently endured challenging times. During such times, newborn babies were often abandoned on the streets, giving wealthy individuals the chance to adopt them as slaves or servants. Famines, epidemics, and fires occasionally resulted in the death of more than half the city's population. Nevertheless, the number of times entertainment was interrupted in daily life in Rome was very few. Even during such difficult times, finding a spot in the Colosseum was not easy. Entertainment continued for both rich and poor Roman citizens alike. They attempted to shake off the day's fatigue at the public baths. Although not as lavish as the rich, poor Romans could still find a place for themselves in social life. If they had some work to do, they would often manage to afford to watch gladiator games. In 33 BC, the number of public baths in Rome was around 170. By AD 400, this number had reached 800. Although baths built by emperors like Trajan and Caracalla were attractive centers for the wealthy, there were enough public baths in the city for everyone, and poor citizens also visited these places whenever they could. Baths had become the central hub for social activities with gymnasiums, health centers, and swimming pools. While the poor could benefit from these sections, the wealthy spent their time in a separate section called bordello. Over time, bordellos became essential venues for the rich looking for good business or partnerships. Many of the poor did not have their own kitchen to cook, so they often obtained their food from a restaurant or taverna, or by renting the kitchens of such establishments. Those who filled their stomachs well at the end of the day became part of the fortunate minority. During the imperial period, slaves constituted almost 30% of the Roman population, with the majority coming from war captives and their children. Rome followed a system where a child of a slave was accepted as a slave from the moment of birth and prepared to serve their master for many years. Many deceased slaves had lived in terrible conditions. When they fell ill, the treatment applied was only sufficient to ensure their efficient continuation of work. Those suffering the most were often groups working in mines. Nevertheless, in Rome, there were various ways for slaves to transition from slave status to libertos or freed status. The most popular was for the slave to buy their freedom by paying their own money. Another way was for the owner to voluntarily grant freedom to the slave. However, this was not a common occurrence. In ancient Rome, slaves' areas of work were not limited to jobs requiring heavy labor. Some educated slaves were capable of easily handling their master's trade, education, or accounting tasks. The most expensive ones were young men and trained slave women brought from Greece. Female slaves usually managed the daily chores of the house. In Rome, slaves were divided into two main groups: those working in public services as state officials or serving in the emperor's mines. Public services belonged to the government, while private services belonged to individuals and were responsible for meeting their daily needs. If a private servant killed their master, all slaves living in the house were killed as compensation. In fact, distinguishing a Roman slave from a free man was quite challenging. Therefore, there were even proposals to present to the Senate for slaves to wear special clothes and thus be distinguished from others. However, the Senate rejected this proposal because it feared that if slaves recognized each other, realized how numerous they were, and united their power, they might revolt against their owners. From the tumultuous early days of the Republic, surrounded by magnificent public buildings, Rome had become a constantly growing, cosmopolitan city until the years after BC. Surrounded by buildings made of limestone, a nearly flawless sewer system operated under the stone-blocked buildings. Thus, even in its contemporary state, Rome had an immense infrastructure similar to modern cities. However, just like in today's megacities, Rome had a life filled with endless hustle, a fast pace, disturbing levels of noise, and dangers. Moreover, even during the powerful periods when the empire ruled the Mediterranean, the city's problems intensified with the concentration of the population. Nevertheless, Rome successfully masked this reality with its splendid buildings and magnificent structures.